Louanne Jacobs. Before we get started, the usual public service announcements. Please, if you will, silence your phones. And for those who are sitting towards the back, right in the back couple of rows, you notice that we are videotaping. Is that the right word these days? We are recording these presentations for posterity. So Louanne, everything you said will come back to haunt you forever and ever, even long after you're gone. But those folks who are sitting around the camera back there, if you would please refrain from speaking, because it will get picked up on the recording. So, now to our speaker today, Dr. Louanne Jacobs, Associate Professor of Education, joined the Birmingham-Southern College faculty in 2008. She received a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, a Master's of Education from Alabama A&M University, and a Doctorate in Education from the University of Alabama and University of Alabama at Birmingham, joined together. Her research interests have included critical literacy, child and adolescent literacy, and literacy and social justice. The title of Dr. Jacobs' talk today is The Waters of Marah, Representations of Holocaust and Genocide in Children's and Adolescent Literature. Please help me welcome to the podium Dr. Louanne Jacobs.
I know it's going to get applause beforehand, so I just may end now. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you. Hey, Jenna. I wear fancy. I asked Jenna what I should wear, and she said, just fancy pants. So there you go. Good morning. Thank you for coming to my Provost Forum. Special thanks to my departmental colleagues, to my absolutely adorable and precious son who's sitting back there, and my nephew Alan, a BSc grad. In case you just walked in because you needed a culture credit, let me introduce myself again. My name is Louanne Jacobs. I teach in the education department. My specific area of academic interest is literature for children and adolescents, and hence this topic. This is my 11th year at Birmingham-Southern, and for those of you who know me, you're thinking now, why has she written these remarks? But also for those of you who know me, you know that I am want to chase a rabbit and not get back to the topic. And those of you who have had me in class know that I want to need you at the end to raise your hand and say, Dr. Jacobs, we were supposed to be gone 5 minutes ago. So I've prepared written remarks. I hope I don't deviate too far from them. Provost forums are a marvelous thing. Time is purposefully and intentionally set aside by the college to accommodate them, to honor them. Faculty, staff, and students are offered a window into both the process and the product of scholarly work. Some faculty members focus heavily on process of research as they present to you, some on the products of their research as they present to you. I'll focus a little on both. However, before I do so, I would like to touch on the significance of sabbatical itself. I don't think we talk about that very often, particularly in front of you students. I'd like to talk about it both in general and as it applies to my own personal sabbatical. The root of the word sabbatical is the word Sabbath and the concept of Shemitah, a directive found in Hebrew Scriptures. This commandment required fields to lay fallow every 7th year, every sabbatical year. Those fields lay untilled, they lay unplanted, so that they theoretically had time to rest, to renew, and to become even more fertile and productive in the future. Get how the two are connected? Sabbatical, like the Sabbath, is a time set aside for creativity, for reflection, and renewal. It's a time to restore vitality by stepping aside from regular teaching duties, just as the Sabbath is a time to restore our spirit by separating the mundane work week from the sacred day of rest, rejuvenation, and worship. If you know me at all, you know that I'm a tiny bit crunchy granola. I'm that INFJ, INFP. I'm that Enneagram 2. I'm the one that sees things. I am a firm believer in the concept of beshert, of serendipity, of happy accidents, of things that are meant to be. The timing of this particular Shabbat was beshert. It was serendipity. It was timely. It was a gift. And while I miss our Provost sitting right here, I'm kind of glad that he's not, because I've already made Brad cry once this year, and I'm relatively certain that what I'm going to say next would make him cry again. This is my mom, Vina Clayton. Prior to my sabbatical, my mother was already in the early stages of Alzheimer's. She no longer drove, but she did independently maintain all of her activities of daily living, the dressing, the cooking a little bit. She even worked one day a week. And by work, that's really work. In November and December, just as my sabbatical was to begin, my mother had 2 small strokes, following a pretty major one. These 2 small strokes began a cascade of cognitive failure. And by the end of December, we knew that she had entered stage 5 Alzheimer's and was in very rapid decline. And so that's how I began my sabbatical. This sabbatical was, for me, not only a time of academic renewal and, frankly, the mundane routines of doing the work was a welcome distraction, but it was also a time to separate from the routines of teaching and committee work and commitments to local schools and teachers, which enabled me to focus on the sacred work of caregiving. My mother passed away 6 weeks ago this Saturday. So much can change in a year. I will forever be thankful to the college, the Faculty Development Committee, and the Provost for this serendipitous gift of time for this sabbatical. And on that happy note, let's talk about something really uplifting. How about the Holocaust? Okay, that was supposed to get much bigger. The title of this presentation is also the title for the first paper that I wrote as a result of this sabbatical work. The Waters of Marah and Translated Memories, Representations of Holocaust and Genocide in Literature Written for Children and Adolescents. And when they came to Marah, they could not drink of the waters of Marah, for they were bitter. And people murmured against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And he cried unto the Lord, and the Lord showed him a tree. And he cast it into the waters, and the waters were made sweet. This passage from Exodus, from Hebrew Scriptures, illustrates but one of the many times that the Jewish people encountered, cried against, and found a way to consume bitterness. Now, though my own religious beliefs are decidedly too postmodern to include a benevolent creator who miraculously intervenes on behalf of his creation in response to their cries, I do believe it is midrashically sound. Those of you who are taking Amy's classes are going, "Oh, I love that word," to suggest that the Jewish people have historically attempted to render bitter waters potable, though certainly not sweet, through the telling of their own stories. In essence, the sufferers have thrown their own words into the waters, telling and telling, turning and turning. Certainly, the Shoah, the Holocaust, is one of the most excruciatingly bitter stories in modern history. Writers, both Jewish and non-Jewish, have over the past nearly 7 decades produced an entire body of literature encompassing a wide variety of genres and formats to tell this bitter story to children and to young adults. Alvin Rosenfeld referred to the breadth and depth of Holocaust literature, specifically that for children and young adults, in its many and varied presentations as reflexes of assertiveness. Love that phrase. Those reflexes of assertiveness stand against the effacement of memory and reinforce the idea and integrity of history. This study is an in-depth examination of what I believe to be the entirety of that body of writing. And it is in the spirit of reflexive assertiveness that I offer the results. Throughout this presentation, I am going to use the words Holocaust and Shoah interchangeably, as they have both come to describe a singular event in modern history. While that event undoubtedly was genocidal in intent and implementation, I do not adopt the concept of Holocaust uniqueness. Let me explain. I don't adopt the concept of Holocaust uniqueness, at least in the sense of ranked ordering genocidal events, which many have referred to as victimization Olympics. My Holocaust is bigger than your Holocaust. Holocaust historian, religious scholar, and P.S., my husband, wrote that from a truly objective point of view, the Holocaust, the Shoah, is unique to the degree that all events of past history are unique. They never existed before their moment in all of their own configurations, and again, objectively, will never be repeated in the totality of those same configurations. For its victims and survivors, for their families and their ensuing generations, it is unique, as is the Armenian genocide to the Armenians, the Bosnian genocide to the Bosnians, the Rwandan genocide to the Rwandese, and the Sudanese genocide to the Sudanese. I am a storyteller. I am a storyteller in the tradition of all Southern people. I am also a storyteller from time to time for actual money. Scholarly work is, for me, a type of storytelling. You begin with an audience in mind, a problem, a question, a story that you would like to tell about that question to that audience. And then you figure out what information you will need, what data you will need, what language, in other words, in order to make the story meaningful for your audience. How many of you read either or both of these books when you were in K-12? Before joining the faculty at Birmingham-Southern, I taught in K-12 public schools longer than I really want to admit. I taught Julie Holly, who is our chaplain. I taught Julie when she was 12. I was about 15. I also taught at LMA&M University, which is a historically black university. I've conducted professional development for teachers for over 3 decades. I never found it surprising that my K-12 students and other K-12 students with whom I worked had read little to no literature related to the Holocaust. I didn't find that surprising. I found it more surprising over the years that college and university students self-reported reading little, if anything, beyond the two texts that we're looking at. Beyond Night by Elie Wiesel, and beyond what was typically the dramatic version, the play version of the Diary of Anne Frank, the one that's often found in middle school or high school anthologies. Sometimes the upstairs room, sometimes the hiding place, maybe one or two others. But I continue to find it surprising that teachers, that librarians are unaware of the vast body of trade literature available with which to present this vastly complicated event. And while both of these canonical texts present young Jewish main characters, one a victim and one a survivor, neither was originally published or marketed to young readers. So what I wanted to do was to not look at sections, subsections of literature. I wanted to look at everything. I wanted to look at all of it. It occurred to me some years ago, after a trip to the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., in which I spent a good deal of time in their library, that the library books that they were publishing, for which they were publishing a list, that collection was much smaller than the collection that I had at my house. It occurred to me some years ago that I might very well be in possession of most of the trade literature written about the Holocaust for a young audience, for children, for adolescents, for young adults. Turns out I was correct. Turns out I don't just own most of it. To the best of my knowledge, I own all of it. If you looked at my Amazon bill, you would know I own all of it. What you see here are two shelves two bookcases in my library, in my office at home. You also see my guitar that I don't know how to play, so if anyone wants to see me afterwards about some guitar lessons, be willing to have that conversation. This study was, and continues to be, an attempt to talk to listen to that mute data, to present it in a format that would be accessible for scholars, researchers, teachers, librarians. Previous scholarly work has focused on an analysis of selected samples of Holocaust literature for children and young adults. A couple of studies and a couple of scholars look at only literature that's in Jewish day schools, or they only look at literature that is for very young audiences. No one has looked at the entirety. In this study, I examined what, again, I believe to be the entire universe of written work on the subject for this readership. However, because I wanted teachers and librarians and scholars to have access to everything available from which to make their own informed choices for creating school, grade level, classroom collections, library collections, and for their own research, I began my research by organizing the collection and information about the collection into a database. Again, if you've ever met me, you know that aggregated, disaggregated database is not anything that's in my wheelhouse. So it was a learning on the job process. There are 501 books included in this collection. 501 titles are included in the database that I created. Entries are limited to books written and or marketed specifically for a children's or a young adult audience, and to ones which, though not originally marketed to a young adult audience, have become part of the canon for these audiences. Back to the Beschert, back to the serendipity, although these not happy accidents. Several events bookended or occurred during or shortly before my sabbatical, which confirmed the importance and the urgency of his work. In August 2017, neo-Nazis held what has become an infamous rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. I'm sure you all recognize these images. Spewing anti-Semitic rhetoric and brandishing the Nazi flag almost totally unchecked. On February 14, 2018, we just marked the one-year anniversary, 14 students and 3 staff members were shot and killed at Stoneman Douglas High School. Many of these students and many others who would later become leaders of the March for Our Lives movement felt a resonating connection between their own experience and the experiences represented by Never Again. And while many of those students caught a lot of flack from Jewish community for using the term Never Again, what was often not reported is that the students had appropriated that term because many of the victims and many of the students who would later become advocates had either taken or were currently taking a Facing History in Ourselves curriculum Holocaust history class. And they found that resonation between their own experiences and the experiences that they were reading about. In February 2018, that same month, the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany commissioned a comprehensive national study on the state of Holocaust knowledge, awareness, and perception in the United States. The results of that study of American adults over the age of 18 revealed that 45% of all adults and 49% of millennial age respondents could not name a single concentration camp or ghetto. Not a single. 41% of adults and 66% of millennial age respondents could not identify Auschwitz. 70% of all respondents indicated agreement with this statement. Fewer people seem to care about the Holocaust as much as they used to. And 58% of respondents agreed that something like the Holocaust could happen again. A chilling thought. In the same year, the state of Kentucky joined Florida, Illinois, New Jersey, New York, California, Michigan, Indiana, and Rhode Island to become the 9th state to mandate Holocaust education for students attending public schools. Most students in the United States receive no formally authorized instruction in this subject. Information gleaned from Holocaust novels and memoirs read apart from any formal instruction is therefore usually the main source of knowledge about the destruction of European Jewry and other targeted populations available to young people. This study is not intended to offer commentary on the quality of, instructional pedagogy for, nor appropriateness of Holocaust literature for young readers. Rather, it is intended as a basis for commentary and scholarly research, as well as a dynamic reference tool for teachers and librarians. I intend to address these topics in subsequent articles, though I would direct you also to the important work done by Hamida Basmajian and Jan Darsha and Lydia Kokola and Adrian Kurtzer, among others. The study presented here is focused on a quantitative and qualitative meta-analysis of the body of literature itself. Through conducting a universal meta-analysis of what I now believe to be the entirety of the body of trade literature written on this subject for a young audience, I wanted to answer the following questions. Most emerged prior to the study. One presented itself as the study was in process. My questions were, what was written? What's out there? When was it written? Because I think that that's important. In what formats is the information presented? And utilizing what genres? For what readership is it intended? Importantly, what are the books about? What stories get told? What stories don't get told? About whom and in what setting or location? The final question, the one that emerged as I was in the process of the research, was by whom? It occurred to me as I was uploading some of my data that I was beginning to see second and third generation authors, or second generation authors and second generation authors writing with survivors. I find that incredibly interesting, and I'd like to look at that pattern. So I asked myself, were the authors directly impacted by the event itself? I'd love to tell you that I began the sifting and organizing of this data in some really technologically sophisticated way. But as you can see, I've outed myself. It was just a lie. I just used good old 4x6 index cards. Guys, sometimes old school works. To organize the information that I would later input into my spreadsheet for aggregation and disaggregation. I organized the data by title, author, year of publication, publisher, illustrator if that was applicable, format, genre, recommended reader age, ISBN number for ease of access, countries in which the book was set, and also keywords. I'll present here only the highlights of my findings, as our time together is limited and I could talk about this forever. This is a screen capture of kind of what the database looks like. So what was written, and when was it written? Look at 1996 to 2017. When I began this study, I'd gone to a conference, and several people were talking about work that they were doing, and I was mentioning this work, and someone who did not know me well enough to know that I might hurt them over this said, "Do you not think that work is dated? You know, is anybody doing that anymore? Isn't the Holocaust something that's kind of old? Kids even care about this. Teachers even care about this. Should we be reading? Is anybody even writing books about this?" And so the answer is yes. Books are being written. Each of the 8 books published prior to 1963 was a chapter book. Let me describe what a chapter book was. Chapter books are books that, you remember in school when you called them the thick books? Particularly when you were in upper elementary school? Well, that's a chapter book. You know, it's chapters 1, 2, and 3. As you can see, trade publications about the Holocaust for young readers in a variety of formats have continued to flourish since the event itself, with the bulk of publications emerging in the market between 1996 and 2017. Indeed, of those 8 trade chapter books published prior to 1963, including Night and including Diary of a Young Girl, none of those 8 books were originally designated for a youth market. And while I've only begun to mine this data by decade, I'm already beginning to see that there are topical themes emerging, which I think are going to be important. Each of those 8 books that were published prior to 1963, again, was a chapter book. And while the majority of the body of literature is indeed in the form of chapter book, Books about the Holocaust also take the form of picture book. A picture book, for those of you who don't know, is a book in which the illustrations and the text work seamlessly together, and which the illustrations carry as much of the information as does the text, and often differing or supporting information. They also take the form of poetry, poetry hybrids, graphic novels, and comic books. Using what genres? I experienced an intense level of dissonance in assigning each book to an individual genre. Some books are hybrids or span a literary divide between genres. Others have found this genre assignment to be problematic as well. Lydia Coppola found that the more she examined these categories, the more they fell apart. I have used my best professional judgment and my years of expertise in genre assignments while recognizing that this literature has, in the words of Rosenfeld, not occasioned any new kinds of writing, but it has greatly complicated all the literary forms it has occupied, and seems to be in the process of breaking them down in an effort to find some new and more adequate measure of chronicling a radical evil and the range of human responses to it. I limited the designation of key topics to each book to 6, and again, those designations were mine alone. I didn't use Amazon key topics or any other key topics. All 501 texts were books that I either read or had read and had noted key topics as I went along. Literary formats used to tell Holocaust stories range from allegory to libretto to magical realism. I have used the designation historical fiction to refer to picture book formats and historical novels when I refer to a chapter book. I use keywords to answer the question, what stories are being told? What are writers writing about? And therefore, what do readers have the opportunity to read about? The most frequently occurring keywords were righteous Gentiles, hiding or hidden identities, and resistance. And while I find this appropriate for a young readership, in that it offers stories of helpers and hope, I hear one of my colleagues going, and I suspect he's thinking what I'm thinking. I find it a wee bit problematic in that it can, if we as educators, teachers, librarians are not careful, lead to an inadvertent appropriation of a Jewish event and a picture of passive victimhood. It has occurred to me in writing a subsequent article that I would like to go back into the data and further disaggregate the resistance data set into Jewish, non-Jewish resistance, acts of passive resistance, and acts of active resistance. I heard you say, As is developmentally appropriate, most books are published for a readership 10 years old and older. There is pretty regularly some grumbling on the interweb about Holocaust texts that are written for very young children, and how dare we present such a horrific event to such young readers. When it is presented in a picture book format, it is often not for the youngest readers. And when it is written for very young readers, it, almost always they include appropriate topics, age-appropriate topics, developmentally appropriate topics, such as helpers, families, pets, small acts of active or passive resistance, appropriate for young people. In addition, as is appropriate, only 47 of the total titles feature adult main characters. Most of these titles include the adult in the role of helping children. Janusz Korczak, Irina Sendler, for example. This allows young readers to more easily identify and empathize with the main character and to more easily live vicariously through those events because they are seeing them through the eyes of someone their own age. Included in the question about whom was the question of special populations. While these special populations are mentioned in text, I only want to refer to the ones where the main character is part of that special population. Only 1% of titles featured a main character who was a twin. Only 4% featured a main character who was Ramasinti. 1% of main characters were homosexual, and 2% of main characters had some sort of exceptionality or disability. Twins, Ramasinti, homosexuals, and those who were disabled, all targeted populations. As I said earlier, the question occurred to me only as I was in the midst of this study. Who was writing the books? 80 of the titles were written by survivors. Some of them told their own stories. Some of them were survivor authors telling other stories. And most interestingly to me, 47 of the titles, I realize that is a very small percentage, but 47 of the titles, all of those titles appearing within the last decade, 47 were written by children of survivors, with one of them, a second-generation author, writing with her survivor mother. I expect, and I am interested to see as I continue to collect the data, I am interested to see if that second generation and second generation collaborative diaspora community continues to write newer stories, perhaps stories, and there are a couple of their own diaspora experiences. Literature continues to confirm that young people, when asked, overwhelmingly associate the Holocaust with Germany. I found that while most books do have Germany as a featured setting, supporting that flawed assumption that Germany was the sole location in which the Holocaust occurred, there aren't 81 books that have Poland as their main setting, much more appropriate, and other stories distributed across Eastern Europe and Scandinavia, as well as diaspora locations such as Japan, Cuba, the United States, Australia, and Palestine. This is hardly could get it on this slide, spread of those countries and those settings. In addition, though the Conference on Jewish Material Claims Against Germany survey reported that 41% of adults and 66% of millennials surveyed could not identify Auschwitz, books are available to remedy this deficiency. 59 titles have Auschwitz as a main setting, with 90 other titles set at least at some point in other camps, including Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Mauthausen, Ravensbrück. while these may have been the books that most of you read in school, and most of you said, yeah, those are the books I read in school, and while they remain the canonical literature of the Holocaust for most young readers, they do not present the totality of the experience. There are millions of other victims and survivors. There are millions of other stories that need to be heard. Many of those stories have been written. All of those stories are included in this collection. Fortunately, many of those rich and varied stories are available if scholars, if teachers, if librarians know where to look. I want to show you just a few of the books in the collection. The 6 books that you're looking at, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about their stories. I included Stone Angel by Jane Yolen just because it's brand new and I love it. It is set in France, and it is set post-Holocaust. It is a story of survival, and it is a story of resilience and passive resistance. Luba, the Angel of Bergen-Belsen, is set in the concentration camp of Bergen-Belsen. That is a thing that 2 decades ago where it was unheard of to actually have a book that was set in the camp, that was written for young people. It is a story of both active resistance, passive resistance, and active-passive Jewish resistance, which tells a big story. Erica's story, written by Ruth van der Zee and illustrated by Roberto Innocenti, tells the story of a survivor, tells the story of active resistance by her mother, an active resistance which was reported by other survivors over the years. The Flag with 56 Stars is a story from survivors of Mauthausen. It tells the story of prisoners in Mauthausen who, knowing that the camp was about to be liberated and believing that it was the Americans who were going to liberate the camp, sewed a flag, an American flag, to hold out in front of them, and arguing over how many states and how many stars were on the American flag. They had to hide the flag because it's not a thing to do. So this is a story of active resistance. The Secret Seder is a story of both active and passive resistance, in that it tells the story of partisans, and it also tells the story of Jewish partisans, and it also tells the story of religious participation and religious activity during the Holocaust. The Secret of Priest Grotto is told, it is a nonfiction book. It is told with photography. It is a Holocaust survival story, and it is the story of saving ourselves, not another population, saving a Jewish population. 6 Million Paperclips is set in a rural community in Tennessee. And it is the story of a teacher teaching her students about the Holocaust, which they've never heard of. And they decided they wanted to see what 6 million looked like, and they began to collect paper clips. It's an Oprah best read, and the kids ended up on Oprah. The cattle card that you see was given to them by a survivor. They know in the Broken Glass, as I was telling you earlier, is developmentally appropriate for very young children, and that it tells the story of Kristallnacht, but it tells it through the eyes of a cat. So it tells about destruction, but it does not tell it in the gruesome detail that would not be appropriate for very young readers. The book is about fear and family and safety. The Cats in Krasinski Square is a story that is historical fiction, based on an event, but fictionalized. It is the story of active resistance, the use of children, cats. The Magician of Auschwitz is a relatively new book, I want to say within the last year. It's written by Kathy Kaser. She is a second-generation author. And it is the story of passive resistance set in Auschwitz. Stumbling on History by Fern Schumer Chapman, who is also a second-generation author, is the story of the art project of the Stumbling Stones. Does anybody know the Stumbling Stones? Google it. Go look. It's a cool art project. It's an art project. I should have put a picture up here of my in-laws and their Stumbling Stones. It is an art project that was post-Holocaust, in which an artist wanted to leave the names of every victim in the town in which they originally lived in front of what would have been their houses or buildings. You will find them, they're sort of gold-looking, and they have the name of the person who died. Mapping the Bones by Jane Yolen, who again has written several on this particular topic. Mapping the Bones is written in a poetry hybrid. It is one of the stories, one of the 1% of stories that features twins. It also features one of the twins who is selectively mute. We never know exactly why he is. There's possible disability there. She writes in prose. He writes in poetry. That's the way their two stories are. It is a story of partisans. It is a story of active resistance. It is a story of Jewish resistance. It is written for young people, and it also is set partially in the camp of Auschwitz. Fortunately, this work this work will allow teachers and librarians informed access to those stories and offer scholars a way to study the literature for young readers in a systematic and universal way. Thank you. Questions? Yes, sir.
I was curious about the keyword frequency found, and particularly the righteous Gentile rate. Consider doing a weighted average of all books by popularity, perhaps using Amazon sales numbers. It could be that one certain themes become truly popular.
You could. There's someone who actually is working on that right now, and is looking at those Amazon sales numbers. One of the things that I find problematic about Amazon sales numbers is that we often buy the books that we know that we're looking for. I mean, sometimes we buy the books that are, and somebody who bought this book also bought this book. Yeah, I think that would be really interesting. What I'd really like to do is go back in and tease that apart. Because I think when you look at keywords, and many of the books are resistance books, and many of the books are hiding books, and if you look at the ones that are popular, and I have looked at some of that popularity, there are a couple of articles on the popularity, the ones that end up in schools, like The Upstairs Room, if some of you have read that book, like The Lily Cupboard, which is a book that is for younger children. The main characters are the righteous Gentile, with the Jew in hiding being a secondary character, a character in need of help, which of course was true. But I'd like to tease that apart. I was really disappointed we didn't say that.
Are there any books that have no uplifting?
Yes?
For young children?
No. Not for very young children.
How
The
about
book,
for adolescents?
yes. The books that have an ending that is not the happy ending but that is literarily satisfying are written for older audiences. Mapping the Bones would be one of them. Another Jane Yellow book, The Devil's Arithmetic. Some of you may have seen the movie. Please don't. The book is just a different story. And the main character, the protagonist dies in the end. Gina, my friend.
How are you planning on getting this information that you've gathered out to other teachers, other librarians, that kind of thing?
Yeah.
What's next?
What's next? So there's bunches of stuff that's next. The first next thing, it's already available, and some people haven't. Okay, people who have heard me present at conferences, and I have said, "Hey, look, I don't own this. I want to make this available to everyone because there are people in English departments who do study this." And so I've just said, "Hey, email me and I'll send it to you." What I would like to do next, or you could just do it for me since you're my friend. What I'd like to do next is I'd like to take the database and put it onto a website that's directly connected to our library and to the Department of Education, so that all traffic drives through the college, drives through the institution. Because, you know, that's maybe recruitment. Yes, sir.
Are there any people working on libraries of this kind of literature in other languages?
Not to my knowledge.
All this is, are any of the books translated?
Yes, not many. Yes, not the entire library. Kelly Russell.
Mine's not a question, but more of a chilling comment about when we were in South Carolina and knowing that people had asked you, why are you doing this? Why is this relevant? And so we sat for 90 minutes as you presented this to us. And then at the end of it, your phone had blown up. Something like that.
You just did.
Oh, well, I didn't tell them why.
Go ahead, tell.
It was while she was doing this, while
While I was doing it, and I left my phone on, silent, but buzz if the phone rings, and my phone was like, and I was like, oh, I'm so embarrassed. Give me just a second. While I was presenting, the synagogue was being shot.
Being what?
The synagogue shooting. Absolutely. Yeah, it was occurring at the exact same time. That's the last chance.
Okay, if there are no other questions, another round of applause for that.